everyone, and welcome to a new Affinity webinar episode. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and to all descendants who have cared for this place since creation. We also honour all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. My name is Dr. Patricia Jenkins, President of the United Nations Association of Australia, New South Wales, Vice President of the Association nationally, and a global citizen who has the deepest respect for and love of sport. The UNAA New South Wales is delighted to partner with Affinity Intercultural Foundation and collaborate with the Foundation's dedicated Executive Director, Cousin Amit Pollard, to present you this webinar in recognition of the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace. This significant day is an annual celebration of the power of sport to drive social change, community development, and to foster peace and understanding. Sport has the power to change the world. It is a basic right, a notable tool to strengthen social ties and promote sustainable development and peace, as well as solidarity and respect. The International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, which falls on April 6, also presents us with an opportunity to recognise the role that sport and physical activity plays in communities and in people's lives across the globe. Sport can help promote fairness, equality, inclusion, and perseverance, and can also help us get through times of crisis like COVID-19 by reducing anxieties and improving physical and mental health. Sport can cross boundaries, defy stereotypes, improve our physical and emotional health, and inspire hope across nations and build enduring friendships. I recently saw a friend of my son Michael, who is in London, and who had contacted Michael over there to see if he was okay and surviving the impact of the pandemic. I was so touched when he looked at me and said, "I was concerned. We will always share a special bond." This was forged at the local surf club and through team building, which has the capacity to help create a better world for all in the wonderful spirit of humanitarian mateship. Tonight, we will be hearing from 4 distinguished speakers who are peace ambassadors within their fields. I truly look forward to hearing from them. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce today's distinguished facilitator, Tracey Holmes. Tracey is an award-winning journalist, interviewing and mentor, and board director. Currently, she works at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, where she covers global intersection of social issues, politics and sport with her popular program and podcast, The Ticket. Tracey has lived and worked in several countries, was Australia's first female host of a national sports program in 1991, and is a firm believer in the power of sport and athletes to make the world a better place. Tracey has a Master of Communications degree from Griffith University and is currently studying a Master of Law degree at Melbourne Law School. Warmest welcome, Tracey.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. Well, the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development recognises sport as an enabler for sustainable development, and it recognises this growing contribution from sport for development and peace. So in this very special Affinity webinar, we're going to take a closer look at sport because it's one of those global activities that has mass appeal, making it a social phenomenon. It has immense influence, attracting both good and unfortunately, sometimes the bad. But in this discussion, we want to look at sport's role in the quest for sustainable development and peace. And we have a very, very special panel. Joining us are three athletes known around the world for their personal sacrifices in championing human rights. First, I'd like to welcome New Zealand heavyweight boxer, former professional rugby league and rugby union footballer, Sonny Bill Williams. Welcome, Sonny.
How you going, guys? Great to be here.
Former captain of the Australian Socceroos, commentator, broadcaster and advocate for diversity and social harmony, Craig Foster. Welcome to you, Craig.
Hi, Tracey and everyone. Nice to see you.
And joining us from Los Angeles today, professional basketball player for the NBA team, the Portland Trail Blazers, Enes Kanter. Enes, really great to have you on board. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you guys for having us.
Now, sport can sometimes be very selfish, a very individual pursuit, but it can also be a game changer for communities. And I wonder what sport means to each of you and how do you see it impacting on your own community? Sonny Bill.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand, I guess, just for me growing up, where I come from, this whole area, housing commission household, I think I've always been taught the simplistic message of helping out those less fortunate than yourself. And I think for us, we've been blessed to have this platform as sportsmen and sportswomen. So I really disagree, and it really gets under my skin, the notion that just because you're a sportsman or woman, you should stick to that space, where I think it's the simple message of helping out the less fortunate. And wherever that space may be, wherever that may take you, as long as you're being a good person and you have that mindset of looking down because it keeps you grateful for what you have, I think it's those people should be commended.
Enes?
Yeah, I think, sports for me, the first thing that comes to my mind is just bringing people together. I think it is a very important tool to, inspire so many people out there, because you can be believing in different kind of topics, you can have a different political views, but I think you can be cheered for the same team. So I think definitely sports playing a very important role in our life, and especially, when you are an athlete, you have a big responsibility to, to inspire, because every step you take, every move you do, that now because of all the social media, because of everything else, there are so many millions of, especially our young generation watching you. So I think it's a very good tool to just inspire millions of people out there. And I think just to get your message across and just trying to educate them as much as you can. I think the most important thing for me.
We'll come back and talk about two of the things you mentioned there, social media, a little bit later, but also that idea that you have to be a role model and the pressure that is put on athletes these days to be that, because not everybody is comfortable in that space. But Craig, when it comes down to community, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Tracey, and great to see Enes and Sonny Bill, two legends of global sport. I think sport is so powerful in many ways. Enes talked about people watching sport, and that brings them together as fans. Of course, as athletes as well, it means that we come to this shared space under agreed rules, which is really important. So you have these globally agreed rules in football or basketball or whatever it is. And if you look in the social context, it's not too often that happens. Human rights might be one, but even then, that's often trampled on by individual governments all around the world. So here we come in sport and we say, we're going to play by these rules, and it doesn't matter what our background is, doesn't matter what our gender is, doesn't matter what our own ability or our past or anything. We come onto the field of play and we are equal. And that is a really important principle that we think, should be propagated in human life. But then there's also the external part of sports power. So, bringing people together, enabling us to break down barriers, inter-country, inter-religious, intercultural, all of those things. But also now we're talking about a really important social institution of sport. So there are few forums in the world, let's take the FIFA World Cup, for example, where billions, around half the planet cumulatively in numbers, come together over a month to share a passion for something in particular. And, you know, there just happens to be one type of sport, being football. So through that prism, then, there's opportunities to talk to like-minded people, billions of them all around the world, about what it is that humanity means. I mean, some of the principles of what it is that we're trying to do, perhaps some areas where we're going wrong, and even, for example, some of the existential issues like climate change. So sport provides us all of these opportunities on an individual, collective, and I would say global level.
Now, Craig and Enes, I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring you, but for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to focus on Sonny Bill because he has to go, and I can come back and chat with you too a little bit later, and we can pick up on some of the things that Sonny has spoken about.
Help me, Sonny, help me, please.
All right, away you go.
I was going to say,
you got the floor, brother. You got the floor.
So nice to see all this sharing. Sonny Bill, a few years ago, you were being called a disloyal mercenary because of your decision to switch codes. It was said that you were in search of the biggest paycheck and off you went on your career. Now we see you're meeting refugees in Lebanon. You're bringing awareness to the Syrian refugee crisis. We know that you've been involved in the Game Over campaign with Craig. So what is it that brought about that change in you? Or was it a change? Was it something that was always there, but you were focusing on other things for the moment?
I call it growth, Tracey. I call it growth. For myself, coming from where I came from, the household that I grew up in, I was never equipped or fully, I guess, equips the word to deal with high-pressured, high-performance spaces. So I call it growth because it was never about the money. I was, you know, my journey to Islam, to faith is well documented. But at that time, I just didn't know what I wanted to, or what I was fighting a war, not against the club or not against what I was doing, but against myself. Like I was trying to find who I was, and you know, I'm a very shy individual, but being able to walk that path and grow as a man, of being able to step into the space where things come naturally to me, and that's, you know, the simple message of do to others the way that you want to be treated. You know, treat others the way you want to be treated. And I feel like in this journey, that's the journey that I've taken, and that's the journey I love, because, you know, the age-old saying of in giving you receive, and I really feel that. And, you know, the plight of the refugees, the plight of the less fortunate, the plight of the homeless, the plight of the indigenous struggling people that we have, that comes naturally to me, you know, and I've, you know, Allah's blessed me with a strong empathy, you know, empathetic heart to those type of individuals. So, you know, I call it growth, and, you know, being confident to step into that space and use the platform that the brothers have just spoken about, that we have as sportsmen, to reach those people in different ways.
It comes at a cost, though, doesn't it? And I wonder if you think every athlete can step into this space or should step into this space, and how should they go about finding something that is of value or importance to them, as you searched for in your own life?
Well, I always think that, you know, unless we know better, you know, we're products of our own environment. And I think, you know, the more you know, the better you'll do, you know, for instance. So for me, that journey of growth, that journey of, you know, stepping in, doing a bit of educational work as well, it's just empowered me to be able to step into those spaces. I think for a lot of young sportsmen, it's that what I touched on earlier. You know, we feel like, okay, I'm not a politician, I'm a sportsman. I'm not in that area of expertise, so I should hold my tongue, because we're fearful of the judgment of others. But I think, you know, it's the simple messages that we need to give the youth these days, that, you know, what you see on, like Enes talked about, the power of social media. What you usually see on social media is the perfect outcome. Sometimes, you know, behind the scenes, it's not as pretty as that. So I think it's hard to step into that space if you're not confident in who you are. So firstly, that's what for myself, I can only go off my journey. And once I became comfortable with the man that I looked in the mirror, that was facing me back in the mirror, once I became comfortable in that sense, then you know, stepping into the unknown, but in the space of trying to help others, just became so much more natural and easy.
How do you then cope with the criticism? Because there's a lot of people, a lot of fans of sport. Their own lives are not so good. Sport is what gives them their release and their escape at the end of a torrid week, whether it's home life or work life or being unemployed. And they don't want to have to wrestle with the world's problems. And so there are a lot of people that say, I just want athletes to play the game. I don't want them to be giving me this other stuff. This is my free zone. What's your message to them?
Yeah, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, Tracey. For me, I always step back and look at the big picture. You know, a lot of people in society, you know, they're not thinking about thriving, Tracey. You know, where I come from, the majority of people are thinking about surviving. You know, they're just working paycheck to paycheck, and the struggles of that and alone in their household brings a lot more struggles and things to think about than solving first world problems. You know, so for me, I always look at, well, that's our space that we're in. We've been blessed to be in a situation or a position to help. So why can't we do it? It's I feel like it's our obligation, but you know, so yeah, it's a difficult one, but I always try and firstly understand everyone's entitled to their own opinion. I'm entitled to mine, but then you look at it from I always try and step back and look at it from a big picture point of view, and when you understand that and you understand the struggles that people have, you can have more empathy towards others, and you understand their situation. And sometimes, for instance, say social media, people come out, and if they do say something negative, usually, you know, for us in Islam, we have a saying about controlling your tongue. The one that controls their tongue is a very strong person, because sometimes you don't know a person's situation, but sometimes, and I've done it before, I've done it many times, I'll point the finger at someone and pull them down, because it makes me feel better. It empowers me, where I try and go around and empower myself through good actions. So I think that's a key message. It's a simple one, but it's a key message that I always try and tell young fellas that I'm trying to talk to and help out.
We've got to let you go to your next appointment, but just your final thoughts, maybe a message for people. What would you like to say to everybody watching today in regards to International Day of Sport for Development and Peace?
Firstly, Enes and the boys, it's great that you guys are on here. I follow you guys, and I'm big supporters of yous, and you guys are leading the way in this space for more athletes to step into it. You know, it's very daunting, but it's very rewarding. So for me, my message would be a simplistic one: just treat others the way you want to be treated, and step back and look at the big picture sometimes.
Sonny Bill, thanks for your time today.
Take care, guys. Thank you very much, Tracey. Cheers, guys.
Thank you, brother.
So, Craig, I'm going to come to you next. I want to take you back to Mexico City, 1968, the Black Power salute, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and sandwiched between them was the Australian Peter Norman. He wore a badge supporting their mission, basically the early incarnation, I suppose, of Black Lives Matter. And he paid a very heavy price. They all paid a heavy price for that. But in Australia, Peter Norman's career as an athlete was over. You've faced similar repercussions for your own standing up for people less fortunate than yourself. Maybe just give us a recap of the Hakeem Al Arabi story and how you became involved in this space.
Yeah, so the issue around Peter Normans are a really important one, Tracey, and you know, Smith and Carlos as well, who are involved there, because it's a really great example of what sport does. And you talked before about you know, people around sport, whether fans or otherwise, and particularly administrators and sponsors, which is one of the big pressures that it has, commercial pressures, saying, oh, we just don't want to hear about all of these social issues, you know, and that this is a free space. And I would question whether there's any such thing as a free space when it comes to human rights. So people's, you know, whose human rights are under siege, under threat, there is no free space. And they're actually relying on others to stand up for them because they're voiceless. That's the very point of it. So therefore, there's an obligation to every one of us in society who has opportunity, and we certainly do as athletes, or former athletes in my case, or I try to use or prefer to use the term sporting citizens, Tracey and Enes, meaning that just because you are a legendary basketballer like Enes, you are still a citizen. And you are still a part of society, and therefore you not only have a right, which athletes have had to fight for, like Peter Norman, but you actually have a responsibility as well to help others who need it from you. Look, the Hakeem case was just one example of a refugee, which is a space that I do a lot of work in, particularly because I think, you know, in a human rights aspect, refugees around the world are one of the most egregiously treated people. And we had a young kid in Australia who was a footballer and to play my game, and was an amateur actually, and he spoke out against torture in his former country of Bahrain, and he was incarcerated in Bangkok remand prison, and he was going to be extradited back to Bahrain, and we're confident that he would have either faced torture, re-torture, or perhaps even worse. So sport was able to do a great job in that example to step forward for this particular refugee, and we were able to get him out after 77 days and back to Australia. The question from that then is to say, well, okay, why did sport help that young man and not others? Why don't we then cross the threshold and talk about all refugees and asylum seekers? Or why don't we go into, you know, the other areas of human rights, as Enes has done in relation to Erdogan and Turkey, and you know, the breaches of human rights against, you know, incarceration of journalists and women and children in jail, and all of these issues. Why don't we, and why shouldn't we? And I believe we should, of course.
Craig, it's very big of you to say that, you know, sport stepped up in this space, but sport actually came, you know, was brought along, dragging. It was kicking and screaming. It was up to athletes and a number of people such as yourself that brought the sport along. Enes, just give us a little bit of your story as well, because the stance that you've taken against your home country of Turkey has meant that for a time you were a stateless person yourself.
I mean, if you ask any of the athletes in this conversation right now, I mean, I think what we are trying to do is way bigger than sport, way bigger than basketball, way bigger than soccer, way bigger than anything that we are playing right now, because it affects millions of people. You know, I think, unfortunately, if you look at my country, Turkey, right now, there is no freedom of speech, religion, or expression. There's no democracy, and Turkish government using their power, they abuse many things like Interpol system, like human rights abuses, and Turkey is the #1 country in the world that put most journalists in a jail, you know. So what I'm trying to do is, obviously, if you look at it right now, I'm not a politician, I'm not a journalist, and obviously this is my second language, but when you see athletes standing up for what's right, you know, there are many examples, like Craig, like Sonny, like in America, like Hakeem Olajuwon, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Colin Kaepernick, you automatically get inspired, you know. And I think for me, the first time I talk about these issues, it was back in 2013 with a corruption scandal. You know, it was President Erdogan and his family was involved in it. That was the first time I went out there and said something about it. And I was like, wow, just because of the platform obviously became a conversation here in the United States and Turkey. And after that, I was like, I saw even power of, you know, maybe one tweet or maybe one interview. I was like, you know, from now on, I need to use my platform to bring, you know, more awareness of what's going on. You know, the last 6-7 years, obviously, the issues that that I talk about affecting me and my family. You know, my dad was a genetic professor. He got fired from his job. My sister went to medical school for 6 years. She still cannot find a job. My little brother was playing basketball. You know, he literally got kicked out in every team because of he carried the same last name. You know, they were getting affected so much, they had to put a statement out there and saying we are disowning Enes. I remember going to a practice that day. It was one of the toughest day, you know. But Turkish government didn't believe that. They sent police to my house in Turkey and they raided the whole house, and they wanted to see, you know, if I'm still in contact with my family or not. And if they would see any, you know, text message, any, you know, missed calls or email, they will be all in jail, which is they took my dad in jail for a while. But, you know, a lot of these conversations are happening. And I had you know, obviously I go to practice and basketball games every day, and so many of my teammates looking at me like crazy. Like, you still have family over there. Why don't you just, you know, Craig feels me probably on that one, but like, why don't you just keep your mouth shut and play basketball? Like, why are you talking about all these issues? But when I told them, when I sit down like this and have a conversation with them one-on-one, I tell them, it's like, listen, my family's only one. You guys know my story because I play in NBA, but there are so many stories out there, so many families out there. Their situation is way worse than mine. You know, I'm talking about the journalists. I'm talking about the women in prison right now. I believe there are over 15,000 women are in the jail right now, and almost like over 800 babies and kids are growing up in jail with their mother. And these women are getting, you know, tortured and raped and strip searched. And there's so many reports out there, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Foundation. Those other reports are saying that these women are getting harassed by the government. So whenever I told my teammates about all the situation, the next question I get is like, how can we help you? You know? So I think it is important to talk about not just basketball, but like the things that matter, you know, bigger than basketball.
Before I come back to Craig, something it's very touching. You know, it's very deep because you're taking this global view. But what happens in those quiet moments when there's just you and you have no family that you can contact anymore? They told the government they disowned you because of the work you're doing. You know, what are those quiet moments like, and is that worth it?
Obviously it's tough because I mean, like, in the end, it doesn't matter what you do, the family comes first, you know. And whenever, like, you're not busy, whenever you're not playing basketball or practicing or playing games or, you know, anything like that, obviously the first thing comes to my mind, your mind, is just your family. But I think, you know, like, my teammates show me so much support. My coaching staff and, you know, the fans, that definitely show me so much support. And they always, like, whenever I have a conversation or interview, they always ask me like this question: if I have any regrets. You know, I wish I had done more. That's my regret, because I mean, I understand my family is my family, and family comes first. But at the end, like, there are so many families out there struggling, and their situation is way worse than mine. You know, so many families are escaping the country, becoming a refugee, living in refugee camps. Their names on the Interpol list. They have an arrest warning, or they get in tortures in jails and raped in jails and stuff. So I'm like, when I sit down and think about all this stuff, obviously, in the end, like, you miss your family, you miss your mom's cooking, you miss your, you know, play one-on-one with your brother, playing basketball, or you know, just have a conversation with your sister. Of course, you miss those moments, but at the end, you sit down and be like, okay, I'm just, you know, what I'm doing is affecting millions of people, so I have to do this for innocent people.
Craig, we heard Enes make reference to Colin Kaepernick. There are others we know inside the sports frame in the USA. LeBron James does a lot of work. There are many of them. What about here in Australia? It's a really difficult discussion to have, isn't it? Especially if it involves issues of race, or if it involves discussion around refugees and our treatment of them, the Australian government's treatment of them. Why is it so difficult in Australia? And why do we try to sideline our athletes so stringently in this regard?
Well, it's a big question because, we're talking about national culture and, how we deal with racism per se. And after the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we've just had a bit of a national discussion around that, which is really important. And every sporting culture... Yep.
I just want to point out that in Australia, we don't even call it that. We've changed the name of it. We call it Rainbow Day. I mean, even that tells you what the environment is like. Keep going.
Exactly. And you can stop me anytime, Tracey. Yeah, that's great, because that's a great point, right? The thing is, and that's kind of the point I was making. And when I say we've just had this discussion around this End Racism Day, what Australia did, Enes, was at governmental level, they basically said, look, this concept of racism is just too much for us to talk about. We just don't want to get into it, and that's going to open a whole can of worms, because then a colonisation of the country and the way we started, and in relation to our First Nations that we've never reconciled. Once you start talking about racism as a country, you now have to start to deal with that. So we're still very much papering over this growing insidious issue in society, and what many of us are saying is, okay, let's just reject that now. They call it actually Harmony Day. So the concept is everyone just get on and let's not talk about the part of Australia that, is ugly. That exists in every country, but certainly exists here, and it's growing. So we need to deal with it. So every sporting culture is different, and each sporting culture is aligned with the national culture, right? So that bleeds into our game. But what I would say about sport particularly, Tracey, is that globally, and particularly in Australia, it got itself into this position where and I think it's largely administrators and particularly sponsors, particularly as commercial entities came into sport in the last 20, 30 years, it was like, well, we don't want anyone talking about these things. We don't want anyone talking about human rights, because, we know in the supply chain we're breaching them, and, we're making footballs over in Pakistan and we're doing all this stuff. We can't have this stuff being talked about by the athletes. We're putting money in here. We're buying silence in sport. That's what we want. We want the brand on, but we don't want anyone saying. So athletes have very commonly been attacked and ostracised for speaking out on basic human rights issues. And so you mentioned the Peter Norman issue. My view is that the future of sport and the trend in sport, thanks to legends like Enes and wonderful people in the WNBA and American athletes are really at the forefront of this. They're pushing their own sports to change and to recognise. And what we have to do is take the burden off the Enes Kanters of the world and put it onto the broader sport. Because when we collectivise risk, we lower it for the individuals. So in other words, Peter Norman bore the brunt in the rest of his life for speaking up on civil rights in America. Imagine that. So I often go around in Australia here, Enes, and I say, imagine that sport got itself in a place when it sells the idea of humanity, shared humanity, Olympic principles, and Olympism means, we're helping the world. And then 3 athletes actually step forward and say, well, we think that racial equality is really important within the sporting context, and they're banned. Like, imagine, if you step back, you just think that is a crazy place for sport to be. But that's what's happened. We need to change that. And what's happening around the world now, Black Lives Matter has been hugely important in this field and in this trend, because athletes have finally en masse stepped forward and said, that statement from the NFL, from our own sport, that's not good enough. Because you put a statement out, but you're not living it. And look at the board, and look at the commissioners, and look at the owners. Okay, we're not having these slogans anymore. You guys need to live up to this stuff. And that's really powerful.
Enes, do you ever get any pressure from your club or the NBA, which I have to say from the outside looks like it's more forward thinking than a lot of other sports? But do they ever say to you when you offer a tribute at the end of each game to another person or another family in Turkey? Do they tell you, we don't want this, the sponsors don't like it?
It's just like, I think one thing that gives me so much hope and motivation, that how much support I get from not just my teammates, but my organization, but the NBA, Adam Silver, the commissioner. It's been so amazing, because obviously it's been a tough road, but every time something happens, Adam Silver actually texted my phone twice and say, listen, if you need anything, let me know personally, and I will just try to help. And like that gives me so much hope and motivation to fight for what's right. You know, other than that, I have it's just not just NBA, but like the Player Association, MBPA, or some of the, I'm trying to think, some of the companies, some of the endorsement deals and everything, or my agency. It's just like it. You can just see, like, I'm trying to tell like the people here like lives in America, you guys are very lucky and blessed to be in this situation, you know, because like how you guys live, you guys have the freedom of speech, religion, and expression, and everything. I remember first time I came to America, and I was watching this channel, and it was criticizing the government. It was criticizing the president. And I told one of my teammates, I'm like, man, they're in trouble. You're like, why you say that? Because like I, you know, like because I said it's like they're criticizing the government, that they're gonna get shut down tomorrow. They're like, no, that's not how it works in America. This is not Turkey. And I was just so shocked. I sit down and watch that news for an hour, and it was just talking about, you know, just some of the things that like, you know, president should have done, and some of the things that president should have done. And I was just shocked, because if that same thing happens in Turkey, the government will come and take down the whole media outlet the next day, you know. And it happened before. If you look at the largest newspaper in Turkey, it calls Zaman newspaper, the largest newspaper. They were obviously talking about all this, you know, corruption scandal, talking about all the wrongdoing that President Erdogan was doing, and he got shut down. You know, and not just that, but there's so many TV channels, so many magazines, so many other media outlets are shut down just because of they criticizing the government. And I was just shocked, you know. But I'm trying to tell the people here, you guys are very blessed, because you guys have no idea what's going on the other side of the world.
Let's talk a little bit about the power of social media, and both of you know how to use this and influence this. And as you're not just speaking to all of your followers and others that are attracted through that, but you have even had conversations with the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey. So what do you hope that social media platforms themselves can do in this space?
And obviously, you know, the last 4 years, I haven't seen anyone just open up and read a newspaper. You know, it is all about what's going on internet. It is all about what's going on social media, Twitter, Instagram. Depends on what age that you're in. But TikTok, that is one of the other ones. But like, it is so important to use it, because now there are so many. Like I said again, I feel like our goal should be how can we inspire and educate our young generation, so when they become, you know, in our age, they won't face the same problems we are facing right now. Because those people, those little kids, are idolizing everything we're doing. You know, everything Craig is doing, everything Sonny is doing, everything, you know, so many other athletes are doing. So it's a big responsibility. You go and do something crazy, all the young generation go and think that is cool to do. So they're gonna follow your footsteps. But if you talk about some of the things that matters to the world, you know, or to your community, they're gonna follow your footsteps. So I think it is so important to use your platform to be, you know, inspire and educate people. And that's why I'm just so amazed and inspired by you know, athletes like Craig or Sonny, because, you know, I want to do the same thing. Whenever I'm done with my career, I don't want to look back and say, okay, I averaged 20 points. Okay, I had a good career. I want to look back and say how many people I inspired, how many lives I have touched, or how many hearts I have touched, how many lives I have changed. So I think it's important to use that platform and be with the world. Yeah.
Craig,
and also,
Enes talks about that. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just going to add to that and say, you know, I think post-COVID has hopefully had a pretty profound influence on the world. And what we see in Australia here anyway is a little bit more of what we call business activism. And this broadly what, you know, Enes participates in and is leading is, people like to call it sport activism. But if activism is just standing up for basic human rights of other people's, then I would question whether, it should just be really normalised for all of us. And I think that's largely what's happening after COVID. More people are saying, look, I refuse to separate my feelings of commonality, of shared humanity, of sympathy and empathy for others from my profession. And so sport acting in this way through Black Lives Matter, particularly now, is really powerful in my view, because it's helping to drive that feeling out into broader community. And that's the power of sport. So when people see Enes standing up for the rights of people in Turkey, for example, and they're thinking, well, I'm going to be an accountant every day, and I'm having to leave at the door my sensibilities and my, sense of what I'd like to stand up for. And I go there and I have to kind of shut my mouth in this corporate environment and, turn a blind eye to some of the things that the company's doing and some of the environmental degradation. I'm not allowed to talk about climate action because the person who owns the company has some view on it. And increasingly and rightly, this is being challenged socially now. And more people are saying, okay, I am a whole person and I'm bringing my whole person to work. And I'm not going to overlook the inequities that are occurring within my workplace or outside, because they're completely linked. I think that's a wonderful trend. I think it's a great social movement that's occurring, and sport is in some ways at the forefront of it because of the bravery of people like Enes and others.
When Enes was talking about social media and the generational shift, I was feeling particularly old. Craig, you're probably closer in my age than Enes is. But when you look at social media and the power of it, what about, and we're seeing a lot of this, and I don't know if it's in different countries, it's operating in a different way, but it's very divided. It can become very divided, and it also can become very much like who is the loudest person in the room shouting at this given point, and people pick their sides. That is also an issue, isn't it? And it's also an issue when we talk about human rights, because sometimes human rights are in conflict. The conflict of the human rights for the LGBTQI community versus a staunchly religious community. So what do we do there when we meet somebody who has their own human rights that they're arguing for, but may not necessarily be in step with our own? Craig.
Okay, so it's a great question. The reason human rights are so important, in my view, is because for all of us, and also, and perhaps particularly for sport, is because Sonny was talking about the political environment is highly contested and is very different, and a lot of athletes don't understand it well and not really that interested in it. And so they think, well, if I speak up on these things, it's political, because that's the way sport likes to frame it. So human rights, in my view, are a very safe space for everyone in society. And again, this is just being amplified through sport. It's no different for anyone else, but it's very visible. And what that means is we can argue for the human rights of refugees without necessarily being political. Of course, as sporting citizens, if we want to be political, and I was speaking out on Australian politics, national politics, and the Republic movement in particular when I was a national team player. I think we're all citizens and we have a responsibility to speak about politics. Nevertheless, when we speak about human rights are politicized, but they are not inherently political. And therefore, it does bring us, the refugee asylum seekers issue brings me in direct connection to Australian and global politics. But that doesn't mean I have to engage in that issue in a political manner. I can choose to, but if what athletes can do, and this is what happened in 1968. In 1968, the Black Power protest, the civil rights protest, was part of the Human Rights for Olympic movement with Professor Emeritus Harry Edwards from US, who's a legendary figure in civil rights and human rights. What they were doing is exactly that. They were saying the shared principles of humanity exist here independent of any particular government. And that's what's really important. So Athletes and sport can ground its advocacy for humanity, which should be a basic principle of all our lives, in human rights. Okay, human rights are contested outside. I'll touch on what you mentioned earlier, but human rights are in part contested because of some religious views, in particular around the world, as to what are the definitions of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and other things. So the benchmarks as to different environments around the world as to how they see human rights slightly differs. Nevertheless, it is the only globally agreed objective benchmarks of how we should treat each other. And it can be improved, of course, but is extremely important in my view. Therefore, this movement, which is another movement for sport and human rights, and FIFA now as a human rights policy, is incredibly important because it empowers sport itself to speak out on these issues. And it provides a framework within which our human motivations to help others can be reflected. It's also important, finally, because when we have these examples, and we had a great, really high-profile one in Australia with a rugby union player, I think he was at the time, his name's Israel Folau, and what happened was it was a flashpoint because it was between the balance of human rights, of freedom of religion and religious speech, and on the other side, hate speech or discriminatory speech, particularly on the basis of sexuality. Okay, so they are two human rights, and they must always be in balance. So they're in some ways contested, and every society has to work out where that line lies. The beauty of what sport can do is it's not always right, and sporting citizens are not always right in what they talk about. So in other words, if we're going to want athletes to be speaking out on social issues, sometimes they're going to say really stupid things. And why is that? Is because the sporting citizens are human. They're the same as everyone else, but it allows us actually to have the discussions. So what happened with Israel Folau is he was actually talking about an issue that touches many Australians and a view that really Australia should talk about. What is this balance? Where does this balance lie? What are the rights on both sides? And unfortunately, because sports culture is now it's all contractual, we don't want Enes to talk out. And if you talk out, we will just cancel your contract. We never get to have that public discussion. More discussion about human rights in society are critically important for a better world, in a world at the moment which is hugely challenged in many ways. And therefore, to the extent that high-profile athletes around the world understand and talk about human rights, the world is going to be in a far better place.
Enes, do you see it differently? And I do wonder that because Craig and I come from this sort of free liberal democracy in Australia. You mentioned before your thoughts when you first arrived in the USA and went, what are these people talking about? You can't criticise the government like that. You come from a very different background and a deeply religious background. So when we talk about separating some of these human rights from politics, do you see it differently? Because in a country like Turkey, everything becomes political, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, I remember growing up. Till Erdogan took the office, I wasn't really paying attention what's going on. All I care about was playing basketball and try to make it to NBA. But once I made it NBA, obviously, I was just trying to pay attention to what's going on in my country more and more. But I think, like you said, everything was just becoming political in the Turkey. I'm trying to explain it. Even like when people talks about human rights, or when people talks about freedom, or when people talks about religion, it's because of they want to get more attention, or they want to get more votes, or if they want to do, if they want to have protect some, about like women's rights or animal rights, they're doing it for they're doing it for a reason. They're not doing it for good reasons. They're doing it for, I'm trying to explain it in a better language. They're doing it for, if you're a politician, to get more votes, or if you are doing it, if you're a celebrity, you're just doing it to get more love or get more attention. It just, that is the one that breaks my heart the most. You know, you see only I have only seen maybe a few people doing it really genuinely and doing it from their heart. But I think, you know, just I feel like right now there are so many programs in NBA in America that, you know, just you know, like NBA Cares program. Now they are educating athletes to give back to community as much as they can by anyhow. So.
And tell me about the support from your teammates that essentially have become your community now, you know, and your family. Are there ever any that question you because they're not there yet, and they're asking you for help in understanding a bigger world, a global world? And do you think this only happens when athletes get older and you bring that wisdom to what you do, and you also are aware that you're probably not going to get sacked in the same way you might, or not get picked ever again if you're a junior player coming through the ranks having such views?
I think so. You know, once when they are very young, like when they're coming in the league, all they care about is just play basketball. First couple of years, it's just so hard to focus on anything else but just basketball and having fun. But now, once you get older, you start to care about other things. You start to care about other people. I remember first time I started talking about these issues. Whenever I walk in the locker room, people were just looking at me so weird because it was very personal. My family was involved in it. And there was an arrest warrant out there for me. They put my name on Interpol. So there were just like very awkward atmosphere in a locker room. They wanted to ask me, but they were like kind of like scared to ask me, you know. But once I get close to them, the conversations obviously opened up, and they got more comfortable, and they started asking me more questions. But now, like, just because of there are so many problems that are happening in America, and I want to learn and educate myself, I ask them questions and they ask me questions. I had a, you know, I asked them so many questions about Black Lives Matter in a locker room, in a training room, before the games, after the games, because I wanted to learn and I wanted to feel their pain, and I wanted to show them that they are not alone in this. You know, they have a guy who's from Turkey are supporting it, you know, and they're showing the same thing, you know. And I feel like that's what brothers means, you know. Now I look at my teammates, I look at my teammates like a big family, and all my you know, teammates are like my brothers now.
Craig, recently we had a situation here in Sydney. You and I are both in Sydney, but it's a thing that probably happens around the country generally. And, you know, something that you're very closely aligned with, the hashtag Racism Not Welcome campaign. And it was put to a vote in a council area, which actually is Australia's most multicultural area. And they voted it down. The mayor actually saying we don't need signs that tell us how to behave, and that this was political grandstanding. Yes, we can see your shirt now. And that's the sign you wanted put up in the suburb. So why is it that in a multicultural suburb, or suburbs around that area, it was voted down, and yet in more what you would have to say are white areas, where it might not be such an issue, they are more supportive? How do you explain that?
Well, politics is one reason, and so I'd imagine what's being suggested by the comment was that there was some sort of split along party lines, you know, within that council area for whatever reason. But secondly, most importantly, were the comments of the council members who voted against. And several voted against and didn't say anything, but those who at least spoke against the motion did so in an incredibly valuable way, because what they do is they express general, damaging, in fact, dangerous views that many people hold in society, in fact, in which I would say in Australia are deeply culturalised. And what they said is, oh, well, we don't want to talk about racism, essentially. And if we talk about racism, that brings more racism. And some will say, oh, well, racism doesn't exist in our, one actually said racism doesn't exist here in our local community. So that's what we see commonly, both in Australia and around the world, is denial of racism, rendering the victims invisible, a refusal to acknowledge that racism exists. And fourthly, even if they do the first three, commonly what they'll say is, yeah, but it's better just not to talk about it. For what reason, I don't know. It's clearly nonsensical. So the point of the campaign, Racism Not Welcome, Enes, is what we're doing. There's 547 council areas. So, we have the states like America, and under them we have all the councils, 547, and we're asking every single council around the country to install street signs like this, Racism Not Welcome. And the reason for doing it is we're saying, this is not about harmony. This is not about inclusion. It's not about diversity. It's not about multiculturalism. It's not about, look, we just got a lot of colors here and we're all getting on beautifully. It's about saying that in our local community, we do not want racism here. We acknowledge that it exists. We use the word. And as we walk down the street, we're letting everyone know that in this street, there's 40 street signs in Inner West, for example, in the city of Sydney, Enes, our largest city in the country, in the whole CBD area, in the next couple of weeks, we'll have these signs up everywhere, which is wonderful. The second thing about them is they're not banners. So what we're saying is, no, it's not a month of banners that you put up, and then the next month it becomes, oh, well, now we've got a, come and see a band next month, banners are temporary. This is permanent. We're saying racism exists throughout history and we need to fight it every day. And you as community leaders need to stand against it. The way you're going to do that is you're going to put visible signs up. And that's going to provide opportunity for people to give testimony as to their lived experience. So what we want to do, Tracey, is create an archive of lived experience of Australians. We want to know about what people have experienced since Federation, essentially, through the families and so on. I'm talking First Nations. And all of our, what we call cold communities here, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, Enes is term used. So they voted it down, not unexpectedly, for a variety of reasons, but sometimes the most valuable moments for a movement can be when people go against the movement, because we now hear the reasons against. And we can break those reasons down really easily, but very powerfully, because people need to hear it. So part of the beauty of the campaign is actually making councils talk about why they either support anti-racism or they don't support anti-racism. And that in itself is incredibly valuable. So last week was a really powerful moment that has made another whole bunch of councils around Australia come to us now and say, we get it. We get what you're doing now, and we want to put these signs in. So in many ways, it was extremely positive. Not, however, for the local community, who the multicultural community will continue to advocate for these signs to go in, and they certainly should, and I hope will do in future in that particular council.
I'm totally amazed that we've managed to get an NBA player sitting on this session for an hour, and I know you've got an incredibly detailed schedule. So I want to ask you, Enes, what are your hopes? If you could have one thing, if you could leave this world having achieved one thing, what would that be?
I think educate people. That's the most important thing, because there are so many problems that are happening in our world because of uneducated people and because of not building bridges. Because what I believe in is, it doesn't matter what your background is, it doesn't matter what your color is, your religion is, your skin color is. The most important thing in life is live your differences on the table and try to find what we have in common. And I always say this and people laugh. I even said this before, till Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos find another planet to live, this world is what we have. So we need to make this world better together, And I think that just one thing we need to do, just go out there and try to inspire as many people we can and try to touch as many hearts and try to change as many lives we can, because this platform was given us by God, and it's up to us to how to use it, So I think that just if you look at that down the history, there are so many leaders like MLK, maybe Malcolm X, or this and that. They're fighting for our young generations, you know. So I think the one thing that I need to do, that we need to do, is just come together and just try to bring love and peace into this world.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because every label that we put on ourselves puts up another block with somebody that doesn't have that label. So I like this idea that Craig mentioned about athletes being citizens, you know, and your view that it's one planet, it's one world, we all share it together. Craig, if you could achieve one thing before you go, what would it be?
Look, I just want to be able to look back and say that I did enough, that I did what was within my capability. And you talked earlier in the conversation, Tracey, about the costs. There are costs for speaking out. Some of the legends of history who were most aligned with human rights and shared humanity, this concept of global citizenry, which is one part I love about sport and why I love to sit on these things with Enes and Sonny, who's from New Zealand, and that's what sport does beautifully, is that some of those great figures in history, they were assassinated. Okay, so, you know, they paid the ultimate cost for actually standing up for others. And what I believe is, the older I've got, I'm able to have an honest conversation with myself more often to say, well, hang on a minute, you should say something there, you should do something there, and you must. You have responsibility. And I see these issues more and more in society as I grow and, you know, and we learn more. And so I'm less able to walk away from any of these issues because I have some tools to be able to help. And in the end, what I believe is those people in history and athletes, Peter Norman and Carlos and Smith, paid a very high price because they were isolated and they were largely alone. I believe in society, not just sport, that the more of us who stand up for the human rights of people everywhere, the more of us do that, the more normalized it becomes, the less cost there is to pay. And that's what sport is about. The more athletes stood up for Black Lives Matter, the easier it was for the next athlete. The more LeBron James and Enes Kanter speak out, the easier it is for the young athlete who doesn't have the leverage. The more of us speak out in Australia, the easier it is to open space for all of the organisations to talk about First Nations intergenerational trauma or to talk about races, because they're the experts. I'm not the expert, but I can open space for them. And I want to be able to look back and say, when I had opportunity to open that space, I never walked away from it.
So can I just say to all three of you, Sonny Bill Williams has already left, but to you, Enes Kanter, and to you, Craig Foster, you have already done so much in making this world a better place. And I thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tracey. Great
now,
to see
before
you,
you go, I'd like to hand over to Ahmet Polat, Affinity's Executive Director, and he's just going to give us some closing remarks. Ahmet.
Thank you, Cousin Tracey, for so generously and effectively facilitating tonight's discussion. We are here to celebrate and recognize the significance of April 6th, International Day of Sport and Development and Peace, with remarkable and admirable speakers. Affinity is truly honored to host the distinguished athletes and ambassadors for human rights, Sonny Bill Williams, Craig Foster, and Enes Kanter on this special day. I say special day because we emphasize the role and importance of sports for education, human development, healthy life, and a peaceful world. We underline that sport is a universal language and different groups and nations unite with this language. Sport is as a vehicle for communication and sharing between groups and individuals. Everything regarding sport in a moment goes from one end of the world to the other. On this day and throughout the year, we truly aim to improve universal human rights and the rule of law, remove obstacles, and change societies positively with global solidarity by spreading peace and harmony and dialogue messages. As far as we see throughout their sports life, Enes, Craig, and Sonny, they gave great importance to sports, while they were always struggling against the opponents on the field and trying to overcome them. They realized that there were struggles that should be fought outside the field as well, for humanity, peace, tolerance, and democracy. In the words of Shakespeare, it is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant. Today's admirable athletes use their strong body, status, success, and popularity that they have developed throughout sports as the voice of our conscience, as the voice of people whose voice has been muted under all kinds of oppression, harassment, and exploitation. The contribution of a successful model players in the construction of civilized societies cannot be denied. On behalf of all people, I would like to sincerely and heartfeltly congratulate Enes, Sonny, and Craig for your tremendous efforts and works. You are the voice of thousands of people and shine light on the many injustices in our society and the many communities who are invisible. I hope that on this occasion of sports, we will reach the days of peace, tranquility, and love that we expect in the world. I'd like to conclude with the words of Fethullah Gülen, whose words echo the altruism of today's sportsmen. There is no limit to doing good to others. Those who have dedicated themselves to the good of humanity can be so altruistic that they will be even sacrifice their lives for others. However, such altruism is a great virtue only if it originates in sincerity and purity of intention, and if it does not define others by racial preferences. Thank you, distinguished viewers, for your time. I look forward to hosting you in Ramadan for some very special webinar episodes. Thank you.